Hi, welcome to the Module 8 Think Aloud, unpacking curriculum using the CUP protocol and revising KUDs. In this Think Aloud, I'm going to pick up on the work that Katie did for you in Module 5, where she unpacked the curriculum for KUDs. I'm going to take what she did and, following the CUP protocol, unpack the curricula to help us better understand our assessments. As I go through, you can follow along with the documents I've created and make sure to pause the module as needed. So here's the overview of the second section of the curriculum unpacking protocol. Now that we're moving into part 2, I'm going to build from what Katie has developed. I'm going to quickly review my curriculum and identify my assessment resources. I know that the curriculum that I have has assessments built into it, which is great. I also have the MAP scores from the assessment my students took at the beginning of the year, and I know that I can look up and see from our state testing how these kind of standards are assessed at the state level. Katie has already done a great job outlining for me of what our standards are, and she took the curriculum and unpacked it into the essential questions, understandings, knowledge, and skills. I love that she's already highlighted for me the math vocabulary. And luckily, we've gotten the go-ahead that we can take out these two red here to replace them as needed. It's a good thing we ran that by our principal. I'm really excited to dig into this use and explain academic vocabulary to explain and justify thinking. That's such an essential skill for students to be able to do. So now let's take a look at the assessment that aligns with the unit that we're unpacking. This is the summative assessment at the end of the unit that Katie tackled. I'm going to go ahead and take this assessment now. As I'm taking this assessment, I'm going to ask myself, what are the different ways a student might answer this question? Are there multiple paths to a correct solution? If so, what are they? What feels challenging and why? If you really want to push your thinking, feel free to pause here and try to take the assessment on your own. Okay, so here's where I've outlined my answers to these questions. Mostly I see with 1 and 2 and 4 and 5, there aren't really different ways that a student might answer this question. There are some potential incorrect answers that I'm already seeing my students might be making just because these require so much precision and attention to vocabulary for students to be able to answer. I see that question 3 here has multiple paths to the correct solutions. Some students might choose to do the rounding the way that I did. Other students might round to different place values when they're doing their addition. And some students might even just add the two numbers as is and not do any of the rounding. All of that is okay because of the way that the question is phrased. Really, I just want to think about how can I help my students be accurate and efficient in their problem solving. So now that I've reflected on the assessment, it's time for me to use my assessment to adjust my KUDs. So I took what Katie had done for me and I made some revisions. I know that this question 3 is really a question that's helping me think about how do I apply rounding? Is this an efficient way for me to use rounding? So I think an important understanding for students is how they're going to use rounding. And the idea of efficiency is such an important one that's going to carry them across their math career. I also know that there's important times when they want to be efficient and use rounding, and other times where it's more important for them to use precision. So that's something that I want them to do. If I can build up that kind of flexible thinking and have them be able to apply it to a variety of problems, that's going to be so meaningful for them as learners. I saw in here, because of these understandings, I want to make sure that I teach them what the words precise, estimation, and rounding are. So I'm going to add in that vocabulary in addition to what Katie already had here. I'm also seeing some questions from the assessment that I don't know if students have in their background knowledge yet. Words like largest, greatest, smallest, least, and especially that word sum, because if they get to this problem number 3 and they don't know what sum means, they won't be able to answer that question. That ties in nicely with this skill that Katie outlined, where they're using and explaining academic vocabulary to explain and justify their thinking. What else I noticed? Well, The assessment is specifically asking them for looking to provide numbers in word form and expanded form. So I want to make sure when we're reading and writing those 3 and 4 digit numbers that we're doing standard, expanded, and word form. I really even want to think about expanding beyond just 3 and 4 digits, because look at how large these numbers are. So that's something I even now need to go back and revise in my skills. I have additional work that I need to be doing when I'm doing that comparing whole numbers through the hundreds and the thousands. I want to make sure that my students can do that from least to greatest and from greatest to least, just like they're going to be asked to do in questions 4 and 5. I see here that we've already built out using place value to round whole numbers. I also want to build in that skill of when we would use place values to round whole numbers when we're comparing them. That ties in really nicely with this assessment question number 3. So now that I've made those revisions to my KUDs, I also know that my objectives can lead to me wanting to do some supplemental assessments. If I switch back to my slide quickly, there are some of these areas within my assessment. There are some of these areas within my KUDs that aren't necessarily covered in my assessment, and I want to make sure that I'm building in assessment opportunities along the way, so by the time that my students come to that assessment at the end, they're really prepared to be successful. So one of the things that I need to make sure I'm doing is looking back at my previous class work to see if I have evidence for how students know if students know how to use tables. I don't want them to be overwhelmed by having to navigate using this table here, when really what I want them to do is the work of comparing and understanding the numbers within it. So let's make sure from our previous class work that we have evidence that they know how to use tables. I also need to look back and see if there's evidence that my students know the meanings of the word sum, in addition to words like greatest, least. Let's double check that. Largest, greatest, smallest, and least. I also want to look back at maybe my map data or any of those previous assignments can give me a clearer snapshot of where we are when it comes to tackling. I'm also interested in learning a little more holistically about what students know about place value. So I'm going to start my unit off with a KWL chart. We're going to talk about what we know about place value and then think, what do we want to know about place value? That really gets kids invested in their learning. We can come back to that at the end of the unit and talk about what have we learned about place value to really make that learning stick. With the summative assessment, I think what I have so far is very strong, and I know that I can't really remove anything from it, but I am going to add something to it. I really want my students to hone in on that essential understanding of when to be precise and when to round. So I'm going to give them an opportunity at the end to do some journaling. The question I want to ask them is, when do mathematicians need to be precise? And when can mathematicians use rounding? I want them generating, because if they can understand the scenarios where they need to use it, then I really think they have a strong grasp of it. I'm thinking a little bit about some of the formative assessments that I need to add along the way, so I know they're successful at that summative assessment. I think some practice spiraled in using larger numbers, having students be able to write them in standard form, expanded form, and word form will be essential practice for them along the way. And it can help clear up any misunderstandings that they might have in what these different terms mean. I'm also thinking that it would be great to do a think, pair, share using this frame. I can add in different examples, but the idea that if we added the blank and the blank, would the sum be greater or less than? Explain your reasoning. I might do some different scenarios where I have a table that's up and I ask students to tell me if I added this data set and this data set, would the sum be greater or less than another data set? I would love them the opportunity to think about it, talk to each other, and then share out to the rest of the group. I'm also thinking that if I want to add this journal question in here as a summative assessment, it would be great for me to give them some time to reflect on it beforehand. So I'm going to do a 3-minute essay. They only have 1 minute, but I think this is going to take more than 1 minute. Have students write in their journals, when do mathematicians need to be precise and when can mathematicians use rounding? And then they can, at this reflection point, compare how their thinking has changed between what they have at the end of the unit and when we do this in our work. Whew. All right. Now let's take a look and use the curriculum unpacking protocol, the final step, to review. To what extent do assessments provide fair, valid, reliable, and sufficient measures of the desired results? So, are students asked to exhibit their understanding through authentic performance tasks? Well, I guess this is a reasonable use of this kind of data. If students are having a table, they're definitely going to be If students were given this table, I think it would be authentic to ask them these kind of questions. I definitely think that this number 3 really helps them because that seems like a reasonable kind of application of estimation skills. Appropriate scoring tools. That makes me think what I need to do for this number 3 is probably think through how could I create a rubric for this, especially if I'm emphasizing wanting students to use that academic vocabulary. I might think through a rubric that includes the use of academic vocabulary into student scores. And then I would want to discuss that rubric with students in advance so they know what it takes to do their best on this kind of performance. Various appropriate assessments formats used to provide additional evidence of learning. Well, luckily, now that I've supplemented with some journal work, some think, pair, shares, and a KWL, I think we've got a variety of assessments. The assessments used as feedback for students and teachers, as well as for evaluation. I think that having them talk about what they want to know, what they already know, and then at the end, review will help them be able to understand how their learning has grown. I also think that the journal work I've done will help students have that self-assessment built in. But that's something I probably want to flag and think through a little bit more, especially if this whole section here, students are encouraged to self-assess. I wonder now, maybe I need to go back and try to think through what are some opportunities for self-assessment. But I think I'm going to bring that up with Katie when we have our faculty meeting tomorrow.